Welcome, everybody. We are going to wait another 30 seconds and then get started. All right. If you joined after I introduced myself, I'm Elizabeth Laird, and I direct the Equity and Civic Technology Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Yes, that is a mouthful, but what it means is that I lead a project that's focused on the responsible use of data and technology by public agencies with a strong focus on schools. So this is part of an ongoing series of research releases and meetings and conversations that we've been having related to a specific type of technology called student activity monitoring software. And today we are doing a deeper dive on the implications of this particular technology as it relates to mental health and students with disabilities and the mental health of students with disabilities. So we're going to be looking at all of those issues today, and just thank you for joining us. Just some housekeeping. We are recording today's webinar. We are also doing a live stream via YouTube. So hello to our YouTube folks who are streaming it that way. We will share a recording with everybody who RSVP'd, and we'll also make this recording publicly available. So if you want to go back and reference it, or one of your colleagues wanted to join and weren't able to, we will be making a recording of this available online as well. And we do have some slides prepared, and I'm going to share with you some research that we released this morning. So hot off the virtual presses. But we very much want this to be interactive and a discussion, and hear from you and how these issues are affecting you and the folks you work with and the questions that you might have. So we're going to take questions a few ways. One is through the Q&A function that's actually part of Zoom. But if you are joining us through the YouTube stream, you can email us at questions@cdt.org or hit us up on Twitter using the hashtag CDT questions. But we mean it when we say we really want to hear from you and be able to respond to some things that are happening in your world. I've already introduced myself, so I will keep it moving. I will also be joined today by Kubatzky, who is my colleague on the Equity and Civic Technology Project. You will be hearing a lot from him later on. Erin Crosby will be joining us. She is a former Young Adult Leadership Council member with the National Center for Learning Disabilities, who we are co-hosting today's webinar with. And just want to say a big thank you to that organization. They do so much amazing work and are just excited to really dive into the impact of this technology on students with disabilities. And Erin is also a current special education teacher who has learning disabilities herself. So we are very excited to, hey Erin, there you are. Very excited to have Erin join us today, and not just hear from folks who are doing this work at the national level, but who are also in a classroom and are directly affected by this. And then last, we also have Lindsay, who is a director of policy and advocacy at the National Center for Learning Disabilities. And Lindsay, we've had the great fortune to be able to connect on this and related issues before. But Lindsay, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add about NCLD or any of your work on this issue before we dive in.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. Really excited to be here with Erin to represent NCLD. We are a nonprofit advocacy and policy organization. We've been around for 45 years, and we primarily work on behalf of individuals with learning disabilities, such as those with dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and also those who have been diagnosed with ADHD. And so we work here in Washington, D.C. on issues related to that. And one of the issues we do cover is student data privacy and student monitoring and other things related to data and technology and how they impact students with disabilities. So really excited to be here and talk with all of you about this important research that you've done.
Yes, thank you. And Erin, I don't know, is there anything that you'd like to say at the outset about anything about your role or how this has impacted your work?
I mean, I can say that from student teaching to now, it's my second year teaching, full disclosure, I've seen a lot of issues with technology and student privacy, especially in relation to special education law and issues. So this will be a great discussion.
Well, thank you. We're very excited to have you. Okay, well, I'm going to keep us moving and just go over the agenda for today. So this is, again, something that we've been working on now for a couple of years. We released some research over the summer. We are going to go through some newly released research that is specific to mental health and students with disabilities. So I will take that part on. Then I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Cody, who will talk about recommendations for policymakers, as well as lead us through a facilitated discussion. And then finally, we do want to have interactive dialogue. So just another plug. And don't just wait until we get to the Q&A part. Like, just if it's on your mind, throw it in the Q&A and we will get to it, I promise you. So I'll dive into the research. So just as a refresher, we did 4 surveys of 3 stakeholder groups over the summer. Those stakeholder groups are teachers, parents, and then we did 2 surveys of students. And the reason that we did 2 surveys of students is that we really learned a lot from what they're experiencing. And unfortunately, they are oftentimes not part of these conversations. So we really doubled down and wanted to lift up the voice of students. And so we're happy to be able to share some of those perspectives today. So when it comes to the issues of mental health and students with disabilities, our newly released research sort of breaks those down into 2 main findings. The first one is that we're seeing in our data that students with disabilities and their communities, whether it's their parents or their teachers, place a greater emphasis on privacy. We found that students, particularly those with learning differences, are more likely to be concerned about how their data is protected, and that extends to parents and teachers of students with disabilities. And interestingly, and this is consistent with data that we've seen in the past, we see greater levels of engagement and knowledge and capacity around privacy among students, parents, and teachers who are working in the disability community. So sometimes our research is unfortunately painting a bleak or a worrisome picture. This is an area where the special education community should really feel a point of pride that, when it comes to teachers, they're receiving more training. When it comes to parents and students, they're having more discussions about this. So there really is just sort of more advanced and more mature conversations happening around privacy in the special education community. But to build on what Erin said about some issues, when it comes to student activity monitoring, we did see that it can pose a disproportionate risk to students with disabilities. And we're going to build on some research that we shared earlier this year about it can have a chilling effect, which is sort of a jargony way of saying that students may be sort of suppressing their true thoughts and feelings and changing their actions because they know that they're being monitored. And then the new information that we're going to share is also how involved teachers of students with disabilities are in student activity monitoring and how it is disproportionately affecting their students. Okay, so without further ado, I sort of have scooped myself, but that's okay. I want to start with what we saw in terms of elevated privacy concerns, which I sort of alluded to earlier. And so we saw that parents and teachers of students with disabilities are statistically more likely than other parents to express general concerns about the privacy and security of student data. So you can see those numbers here that in both cases of parents and teachers, they are more concerned about privacy generally. So this is not just specific to student activity monitoring, but coming into this conversation, are you concerned about this? Both of those groups are more concerned than their peers. That also extends to students, especially those with learning differences. So if you see in this chart, students with learning differences have statistically higher levels of concern about student privacy. We do see directional differences with students with physical disabilities, but that difference is not statistically significant. But I think the general trend and story here is that whether you're a student, a teacher, or a parent, if you are more engaged or directly connected with a student with a disability, you sort of enter this conversation with heightened privacy concerns. But again, it's not just concern, it's also that we see much higher engagement among the special education community. So when we ask teachers about whether they are discussing data privacy with their students, and again, this is not specific to student activity monitoring, but are you just talking about this with your students? 91% of teachers of students with disabilities said that they have, and that's compared to 70% of general education teachers. So I think that special educators and teachers who are working with students with disabilities should feel really good about this, because, when we've done focus groups with parents, the place that they want to go to get this information is from teachers. So the fact that we're seeing teachers who are working with students with disabilities having more of these conversations is actually really a great thing, and that they are likely learning things that their peers could benefit from. So it's sort of like the calls coming from inside the house. Like, you have folks in your building who are doing this already to some extent that your other teachers and faculty and honestly probably leaders could really learn from. And then similarly, we're seeing a similar trend among students. So students with learning differences, students with physical disabilities, as well as their parents, across all of these groups, they are having more engagement with their school. And so in particular, the graph that we see here is those groups who are agreeing that their school or district has asked for their input to inform how they use data and technology. So that's really pretty amazing, that within this community, what we hear so much about is the need for communities to be involved in these conversations, and that one of the pillars of responsible data use is that you are engaging those about whom you're collecting information. And so that is happening within the special education community. And is there more room to grow? Of course. But those are some pretty stark differences between students with disabilities and their parents, and then those who don't. Okay, so actually I'm going to go back here, and Lindsay, I have a question for you. And the question is, and especially given your background and when you describe the mission and the focus that your work has, I'm wondering, what do you think is behind these elevated, both sort of higher levels of concern, but also more engagement that we're seeing among the special education community? How are both of those things coming about?
Yeah, really great question. And we think there's a few things going on here. So first, our hypothesis is that students and families are more likely to be engaged around technology and privacy because they're likely talking about these issues in their IEP meetings or when discussing accommodations related to their physical disability. So in an IEP meeting in schools, school staff, the student and family should be talking about the progress the student is making and any additional supports the student might need. For students with physical disabilities, it could be that the school staff has access to medical records or other private information, and so they might be discussing that with the student and family. And so oftentimes the content of these records is often very sensitive or personal to the family and the student, and therefore it's really important for them to feel like this information is private and confidential. Privacy matters for the disability community because not only because we should all have ownership of what is shared publicly and with others, but unfortunately that there's still a stigmatization about having a disability, and records related to someone's disability is deeply personal and could be damaging if it isn't kept private. We know that students with disabilities are more likely to experience bullying, harassment, and discrimination. And it even changes how some schools interact with the student. And so it's really important that we are good stewards of data and that parents and students understand who has the access to that data and how it's being shared.
Right, thank you for that. Yeah, I feel like it's like a bright spot among our research that highlights a lot of issues, but this is one where we're seeing sort of better practices. So it's nice to be able to talk about that for at least a little bit, but enough pleasantries. Let's get to some of the challenges that we're seeing. So pivoting from sort of general privacy concerns and general engagement practices around privacy and responsible data use, I'm going to talk more about the direct intersection with student activity monitoring. And so what we have previously released in our big report that we shared in August of this year is that about half of students, half of all students that we surveyed report this chilling effect. And so the way that we measured that is that they agreed that they do not feel comfortable expressing their true thoughts and feelings online when they know that they're being monitored. So that was about half of students. And what we called out at the time and what you can see here is that experience is actually more pronounced among students with learning differences and students with physical disabilities. So, when you think about this in an educational context where you want people to express themselves, you want, youth to be able to make mistakes and learn, like that is part of what you want to be happening in an educational setting. These tools, sort of generally speaking, can undermine that for at least half of students who took our survey. And then that is even more pronounced among students with learning differences and students with physical disabilities. So I think there's a real question to be asked here about, these tools are ostensibly being used to keep students safe, but the negative effects that it can have, in particular on, students feeling like they can't actually express themselves, I think is really important. And some of the aspects of student activity monitoring, there are potential paths forward to solving them. So we'll talk in our next webinar about law enforcement interactions. You can make a choice to not share information with law enforcement. I think, to me, like, this is the one that there's just an irreconcilable difference, that when you monitor what students are doing, this is the trade-off that you will always be making. And you can try and minimize when you're monitoring, you can try and minimize what you're monitoring, but that just by monitoring students generally, this is the kind of thing that you're going to see. So we had shared that information previously. So now we're going to get into some of the new information that we released this morning. And so what we found when we looked at the survey information from teachers is that students with disabilities are getting flagged more often by this software. And when you combine that with some of our other information about how this is used, in particular for disciplinary purposes, that it's more common that when students are flagged that they're disciplined than they are, to be given assistance. And that when that is occurring more frequently among students with disabilities, this again has the potential, and likely is, reinforcing what we've already seen about students with disabilities being disciplined at a disproportionate rate compared to their peers. So some of the examples here of when they're getting flagged is if there is a need to sort of intervene in an urgent way. This is, to some extent related to threats of mass violence. And just as an aside, like the survey was administered right after the Uvalde school shooting. So we think that, some of these numbers were certainly influenced by that. That was on the mind of our entire country. That it's also flagging when a student may be engaged in destructive or illegal behavior, and then students actually being contacted by law enforcement as a result of being flagged. 50% of teachers with students with disabilities said that had happened to them, compared to 37%. So when we see sort of those numbers being driven up at an aggregate level, a lot of that is happening within the disability community. Next up is how often teachers are receiving these alerts. So almost half of teachers who work with students with disabilities get alerts at least once a week. That's compared to 32% of other teachers. So again, when you look at the average of this number, it's teachers of students with disabilities who are really receiving these alerts at a disproportionate and higher rate than their peers. And when it comes to teachers of students with disabilities, they are also just more involved in the actual response. Not only are they getting flagged more often, they're also responding more frequently. So 43% of teachers say that they're responsible. 43% of teachers who work with students with disabilities are responsible for responding to mental health related flags, compared to 27% of other teachers. And then finally, Erin, I'm going to have a question for you to sort of help us ground some of this research and what your experience has been, both when you were with NCLD and now with, being your second year of teaching. But we're also seeing, when we ask students either with a learning difference or with a physical disability, across the board, they just have higher concerns about this. So 46% of students with learning differences and 48% of students with physical disabilities say that it is unfair. They agree that it is unfair for schools to monitor how students use devices the school provides. And you see those numbers drop off by 20 percentage points when you ask their peers. So just in terms of the fairness of monitoring in the first place, you really see elevated concerns among students with learning differences and physical disabilities. And then just general concerns about this monitoring. So if you are a teacher of students with disabilities, when we ask, how concerned are you about this practice generally, 72% of teachers said who work with students with disabilities say that they are concerned, compared to 51%. So that's, again, over a 20 percentage point difference in terms of levels of concern, and seeing it that much higher among teachers who work with students with disabilities. And then finally, with parents, spoiler alert, we see the same trend. 65% of parents of students who have IEPs or 504s express concern about student activity monitoring, compared to 57% of other parents. So Erin, my question to you is, I just rattled through a lot of data. So my question to you is, why do you think that, students with disabilities, or parents who have students who have a disability, or teachers who work with them, why are they more concerned? And what is there heightened harm or just disproportionate harm that could come to these communities because of student activity monitoring?
That is a really deep question that you asked. Also, disclaimer, you might hear my special needs brother in the background. So if you hear like a E sound, disregard it. It's my brother having a good time. So in terms of like the increased concerns, I mean, both as like during my time at NCLD, I was in college at that time, and as a teacher who had to student teach during the remote learning age, where this technology was used to determine whether students were, one, attempting to log on, and two, what they were doing with work-wise, since there's only so much we can do remotely to help them. But in terms of the concerns, a lot of us know that our students with disabilities are more likely to be disciplined compared to students without disabilities. And I think that's one major root of the concern, because there are some parents I have where it's like, if I get a call from you, either it's good or it's really bad. Like, I get nervous every time you call. So I'm like, very understandable. And I've heard stories of students getting suspended or like getting a ridiculous punishment for something so minor, but their mainstream peer could do this exact same thing. And either there's no punishment, or the punishment is less severe compared to my student. I'm just looking at the data again. But touching on the point that it's unfair, I can definitely see why it's unfair. And let me tell you why. When I was student teaching, I had a second grader. At the end of every day, he would tell my cooperating teacher, "You're going to turn off Dino, right?" And Dinos was the software, the monitoring software that the district was using. And then he proceeded to say, "Because what I do on the computer after school is none of your beeswax." So students are taking a very like reasonable stance, being like, "Why do you need to know what I'm doing outside of school? It's not school time. And also, like, you could be spying on me, and then I can get in trouble for something that I'm doing that isn't even happening during school time." And I gathered that from second and third graders during remote learning.
Yeah, thank you. And not to add more data, but to just further Erin's point, when we did our survey, only 45% of all teachers said that monitoring was limited to school hours. So what Erin's talking about is not an anomaly of students going home and being monitored, whether it's on a school issue device or sometimes even on their personal device if they're logged into a school account. So Erin, your experience, unfortunately, is not uncommon, especially with the way that this technology is working and how it's configured. So I thank you for that.
I 100% agree. And when I was student teaching, some teachers would honor it and turn it off, while other teachers wouldn't. And that create a lot of unnecessary conflict, which might fuel discipline rates and more concerns amongst parents.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cody, and Erin and Lindsay, we are going to come back to you. So stick with us, but Cody is going to go through just some policy recommendations for policymakers if we're seeing these problems and we're seeing a disproportionate impact on a community that frankly is already, there are existing protections for individuals with disabilities, including students. So from a policymaker perspective, how can we apply those existing protections to this new technology? So Cody, I'm going to turn over to you before I steal your thunder.
Excellent. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you everyone for joining us here this afternoon. I'm going to run through some recommendations that CDT has made to different policymakers, usually at the federal level, about how they can help mitigate some of the harms that Elizabeth has identified during the main part of the presentation today. Not surprisingly, some of these recommendations are going to involve the United States Department of Education. However, there might be one surprising here, which is the Federal Communications Commission, and we're going to start there. So our first recommendation that we've advocated for before the Federal Communications Commission has been to clarify a certain law known as the Children's Internet Protection Act, or CIPA. CIPA is the law that governs the rules that the FCC can award to schools to connect with broadband internet in classrooms. That program is known as E-rate. Now, CIPA, which has the rules for the E-rate program, includes one clause that uses the word monitoring. It requires schools to monitor the online activity of minors. And at first, you might think that it requires this sort of technology. But we've done a good deal of legal research, and we don't think that's necessarily the case, particularly because the CIPA was passed in 2000, which predates many of the technologies that Elizabeth was discussing this afternoon. Also, CIPA itself includes a disclaimer that says that nothing in the statute will require the tracking of an identifiable minor or adult user. The technology we've seen here today definitely involves tracking identifiable minors and users. So we, along with a coalition of other civil rights, education rights, and digital rights partners, called on Congress last year to clarify the word monitoring CIPA, primarily so that schools know that their E-rate funding, which is super valuable, doesn't require them to implement this sort of technology. We've also advocated to the FCC, which is responsible for administering E-rate and CIPA, to provide that same clarification. Beyond the FCC, we've also advocated before the U.S. Department of Education to provide some guidance to schools. This fall, a coalition of digital, civil, and education rights organizations, including CDT and NCLD, wrote to the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, urging them to issue a policy statement that addresses some of the disparate impacts of student activity monitoring software. That policy statement would help outline the ways that Section 504, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, help address some of the harms that we're seeing this technology cause to students with disabilities and students with learning differences. We do want to acknowledge, though, that the Department of Education has made some key strides here. Earlier this year, they released guidance on disparate discipline and students with disabilities, and they noted that using surveillance technologies is among the practices that schools should seek to review when they are thinking about their compliance with Section 504 and avoiding disparate discipline for students with disabilities. Finally, we have also advocated for the U.S. Department of Education to use its civil rights data collection to better understand the role of student activity monitoring software and other surveillance technologies in causing disparate student discipline. We've urged the department to provide guidance to schools on how to collect that data and measure the harms that arise from this technology. In addition to these three advocacy efforts that we've made, there are other ones out there that we haven't explored, and we invite some discussion on today. One is that the U.S. Department of Education has committed, in light of the White House's AI Bill of Rights, to issue guidance on how to safely use automated decision-making and other artificial intelligence in a way that will protect and respect students' civil rights. We support the department's commitment to providing that guidance and hope it addresses student activity monitoring as well as other technologies that cause disparate impacts. Second, we would champion listening sessions with the Office for Civil Rights and the Office of Educational Technology within the Department of Education. And then finally, Congress has a role here to ensure that the use of funding provided under the COVID relief acts, as well as the recent school safety bill, are used in a way that protects and adheres to students' civil rights. So, Lindsay and Erin, let's turn to you and your thoughts on some of these policy avenues. How can these different policy avenues help protect students? Are there other ones out there that you would like to see implemented, or perhaps ones outside of traditional policymaking avenues like Congress and the agencies? I'll go to Lindsay first and then to Erin.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, and I think if we could go back a couple of slides, I just try to walk through a few of those. But that first one is really important because, as Erin sort of described in practice, what does monitoring mean, and how have we allowed school districts to monitor students, and how does that make our students with disabilities in particular feel safe and included in a school system? And so if we continue to have this broad definition of monitoring, where we have this algorithmic technology that can scan students' messages and documents and all these different things, is that really the intent of the law that we're trying to implement? Or is monitoring, can it be more targeted, and can it be evaluated in terms of whether it's biased against certain individuals, such as students with disabilities, but also LGBTQ students and other historically marginalized students? And so I think it's really important that the federal government look at the definition of monitoring, and be very clear about what it is and what the goal is of that bill. The second one is enforcing civil rights protection. So I think Elizabeth mentioned we have the tools to protect students. It's whether we're using those tools and whether we're enforcing those that I think is one of the biggest issues. So the Department of Education, one of its primary responsibility is to protect the civil rights of students, including students with disabilities. And so they should be issuing guidance and raising awareness that some of these practices are likely discriminatory against individuals with disabilities. And I'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about some of the other laws, but I think making sure that we really understand how Section 504 protects students with disabilities, and that extends into the technology area. And then
excellent, very, very insightful, Lindsay. We appreciate that. Erin, what sort of things would you like to see policymakers at the federal level, at the state level, or at the school level do to help protect students with disabilities?
Very good question. And most of my thoughts are really about like making sure that declarifications under like local laws, especially like with IDEA and Section 504, are specific, like monitoring, what's acceptable monitoring from a school and what's not acceptable. For example, I think that if there's any monitoring software used for whatever reason, it needs to not be active outside of school hours, and be very specific on what that means. So the moment students walk in and the moment they walk out, it's turned off. They're not traced outside of the school. And I'm not sure if other states have a similar law, but in Massachusetts, whenever there's an IEP annual review for a student, we're required to consider their risk of bullying, either like their peers targeting them or the student being the bully towards others. And if it's determined that yes, we have to add accommodations or other supports in the IEP to address that issue. And this discussion has kind of got me wondering, like, what if there is something like that, but for like technology use and monitoring? Like, is the student more likely to, say, for example, like access sites that are more likely to get them flagged or anything along those lines? I'm not sure if I'm exactly making sense, but
I think the point that you're bringing up is a really good one. You touched on a few really good points. One is this thing that drew us to this topic, which is devices have gone home. We live in a very connected age now, and that includes education. And so what was once monitoring that occurred on computers hardwired to a school computer lab is now following kids home. And that was very true during the pandemic, and it's still true today. But then also the impact of are certain students being disproportionately flagged because they're seeking out sites that are valuable for them and will help provide them resources.
Yeah.
And that's a disparate impact that we want to make sure.
And I will say in my school, there are some sites that are blocked for no reason. Like I cannot even access Google Calendar at my school, but it's only in my building. Everywhere else in the district is able to. And certain administrators have the discretion to block certain sites, whether it's like a quote unquote bad one or not. So I would like to see like periodic reviews and critical reviews of like the sites that will get a student flagged, how those sites are categorized, especially if a student accesses a site that the school district has not evaluated previously.
Yeah, it's a great point. And SIPA includes not just the monitoring provision we've been talking about today, but also one on filtering. And the two together can have a disproportionate impact on students who are seeking nothing malicious and nefarious, but simply resources that will help them. We're going to spend a few minutes now in a panel discussion, going over a few questions with Erin and Lindsay. But again, the Q&A is open. We already got a couple great questions in the Q&A that we'll touch on toward the end of the webinar. But again, feel free to put any questions you may have into the Q&A panel. So Erin and Lindsay, let's talk a little bit about data ethics. So how can school administrators responsible for data privacy be more mindful about the concerns that we've talked about today of students with disabilities? We started with Lindsay last time, so Erin, we'll go to you first. So how do you think school administrators can be more mindful about the impact of this technology on students with disabilities?
I think one more quote unquote simple step to take is if a student is flagged, investigating the flag and what the circumstances were when the student accessed that site. Did that student access it by accident or was it intentional? When I was in high school, there was monitoring software, and if you tried to go on like a certain site, it would revoke your whole privilege to use the school Wi-Fi, regardless if you're using it like on your phone or like other device in the school. And I had some friends who lost their privileges pretty quickly in the school year, and they had to jump through more hoops just to get assignments done, because in order for like a computer in the library to hook on, they had to put in their username and password. If theirs didn't work, they had to get like a generic one. And sometimes the generic one worked and sometimes it did not. So just being critical on disciplinary measures, what are they? And just being mindful of the statistics of occurrences.
It sounds like an important part of what you're saying is an opportunity for like review and to engage a trusted adult outside of what the algorithm is saying.
Yeah, like behind the scenes, teachers or administrators should investigate it as best they could. Even like asking the student, like, I mean, this may feel really creepy, but sometimes if students are in a computer lab, the teacher can see what websites they're on, but it's only in that computer lab, and the teacher can block the site to say like, turn around. It's just a message that pops up, say, turn around and look at me. But I mean, some teachers ask students why they're on that website, and some students have like a legitimate reason, like, oh, like when I Google something, the preview of the website, saw something promising, I clicked on it, but now I can't find the information. Now I got to go back. That's why it got flagged. And if the student is like genuinely like, why did this get flagged? Like, I remember I got flagged for something similar to that I didn't understand why it was flagged. Sometimes the software just flags websites that are unfamiliar to it, regardless of the content. So disabling that feature would be nice, because that reduces the number of flags.
What do you think administrators can do to be more mindful about the impacts of this technology on students with disabilities?
Can you repeat that? Like, part of your sound got really quiet, and then I heard the end.
Oh, I'm sorry. I asked the same question to Lindsay. What can administrators do to be more mindful about the concerns of students?
Yeah, I think well, NCLD thinks there's a few ways we could do this. First is we could talk to the students themselves prior to implementing any school monitoring software. We can talk to students with disabilities, and we can talk to their parents to see where might there be pitfalls that we could run into, particular to the community that you represent. So I think prior to any implementation, it's really important that we get buy-in from all the different communities. Second, I think Erin was sort of touching on this, is that we think there should be an ongoing review process to determine, are we identifying certain students are we over identifying certain students, such as students with disabilities, as part of this software. And then we think just being transparent about where is this data going, how is it being, how is your child being monitored, or how are you as a student being monitored, what occurs once you've been flagged for monitoring. It'd just be really transparent about the entire process if you do choose to have a school monitoring system, because it's really important that students and parents have a clear expectations of what this means for their behavior. So I agree with a lot of what Erin said, but a lot of it is, communicating with students and parents about the implications of this type of software.
Transparency is so essential. And on the part about knowing whether or not the technology is impacting marginalized groups of students, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Markey released a report earlier this year, perhaps late last year, based off responses from 4 major vendors of this technology. And they universally did not have the data to know whether or not their technology was harming certain groups of students. So I think administrators having a plan for answering that question is absolutely essential. I'm going to turn to one more question before we ask some of the audience questions. This one will start with Lindsay again. How can education leaders concerned about school safety regain the trust of students with disabilities who are disproportionately impacted by this software?
Yeah, regaining the trust is really important. And I think first it, goes back to communicating with that community that you've lost the trust with. And so it's really important that that's the first step, is you discuss the implications of this school monitoring. But I think there should also be flexibility within the system and understanding where these students are coming from. Like Erin was saying, some of her students say, we don't want to be monitored outside of the school day and things like that. So I think it's really important to take those concerns into account and try to determine whether, have you had an opt-out clause in this process, or is that an automatic thing once you're given a device as a student? Are you automatically opted into being tracked? There's other things that I think we can give students and parents the opportunity to weigh in on the types of systems that we put into place. And we should also acknowledge when these school monitoring systems are not working for particular groups of students, and try to reevaluate and possibly implement a new type of system. So I think understanding that you might be you might have implemented something without fully understanding the implications of how it interacts with different groups of students.
Review is an essential part of, I think, any technology adoption, especially when it has the potential to have these sorts of implications. Erin, same question for you. How can educational leaders concerned about school safety regain the trust of students with disabilities who are impacted by this software?
Well, the first thought that came to my mind is a genuine apologies for every single student that was wrongfully disciplined. That's a big step, because through my school experience, when I was wrongfully disciplined for anything, there was rarely, if ever, an apology. It's almost like school administrators sometimes didn't want to admit that they were wrong. The adults are always right and the kids are always wrong, even when there's evidence to suggest the contrary. To the very few teachers that actually apologized to me when they made a wrongful assumption about me, that I still proceed with caution, but I saw it as a way that they're trying to do better. And just seeing concrete, obvious steps to do better to serve students with disabilities that the students can see, that they know about, and have that discussion with them about how things are going to improve and what to do if you think we're going in the wrong direction or something isn't working or we're slipping back to our old habits, because we do it to our kids all the time. Like, they're making progress, and the second they slip, like, some of us are like, you're not supposed to do that. But just having some grace and allow the students to like have that independence and to show the school system like the characters they truly are, and not just automatically assume that they're like the bad kids.
No, that's, I think, absolutely correct. And their engagement with the impacted populations is so important, and something that doesn't always get implemented. And the apology has a strong role in a sense of restorative justice, of bringing people back into the fold after they've been wronged in a systematic way. We're going to pivot now to a couple of audience questions. Again, keep them coming in. This one I think is going to be for Elizabeth. Donna asks, does activity monitoring software solely include software with automated flagging functions? I'll let you take it.
Great. So I'll give you the definition that we used in our survey. I'll say that we try to define student activity monitoring to be inclusive, meaning there are standalone products whose sole purpose, or one of their main sort of functions, is to track what students are doing online. And that can be anything from what Erin and Lindsay had talked about in terms of the sites that they're visiting, to scanning their messages, to look for keywords that could be problematic or troubling, all the way to also what Erin mentioned of taking sort of real-time control of a computer, or like sending messages. And then that same kind of functionality can also exist in other broader educational focused tools. So a learning management system can enable some of that. It can track when students are logging in. So that's how we defined it. We defined it as something that is tracking what students are doing online. And it can include some of the things I talked about, anything from tracking logins to scanning messages to looking at what sites students are visiting. And that monitoring can happen either as a standalone product, or it can also be included as part of other broader tools that also have some tracking functionality in them.
And that the scope of that definition was partially in response to actual reports of events happening at the K-12 level in higher education. Something as seemingly benign as noting when students have logged into a learning management system could be used for discipline. And we saw that in an example at Dartmouth last year, where a student was noted to have logged in during the course of an exam and was disciplined for academic disintegrity. His claim was that that was his other computer where he left the website open, but even something as simple as that has been used in similar purposes. We've seen this more advanced technology like flagging software used. Jennifer also asks, why does SIPA require monitoring of students? What was the goal behind that provision? I'll jump on this one and then invite others to share if they like. Elizabeth, I'm going to attempt to steal screen sharing from you. It looks like I was successful. The power's going to go straight to my head. What we have here is a slide deck. I mentioned that we've been before the FCC before. All the commissioners have seen this. They know us well. And it's the results of some of our research on the history of SIPA. And I share it for one specific purpose, which is the quote at the bottom by Senator Patrick Leahy during debate over SIPA. And you can tell from this quote, which I encourage everyone to read, I find it humorous as well as insightful, is that the vision for monitoring was not highly advanced algorithmic technology, scanning students' emails and chat messages with one another, but a trusted adult who is keeping an eye on children. And that's easier to envision in a period when students were using computers that were hardwired to a school network and the teacher was walking around the room. But now that we're in a more mobile age, it's important to take that same principle of encouraging students to work with trusted adults and think about how it has to be tailored for an age of Chromebooks and Wi-Fi hotspots. But again, this is the method that Congress had in mind, and we shouldn't be tethering schools to a more invasive, technologically advanced method than what Congress had in mind. So I think the purpose here was trusted adults, supporting students, coaching them on how to be digitally literate rather than surveillance technology. All right. Turning back to, I think, one other question before we close it out for the day. Lindsay and Erin, one question that we've been wrestling with is, how do you think that these programs might put students with disabilities in the school to prison pipeline? I'm going to go with you first, Lindsay.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. And I think, do I have it right that you have another webinar coming up that might touch a little bit on this with interactions with law enforcement?
That is right, November 17th.
So yeah, so I'm looking forward to that one. But one thing that is really concerning for the disability community is often this school monitoring software flags it and then skips sort of the process that you need to go through under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, where they have to do what's called a manifestation determination. And this is where you determine whether the behavior is because of a result of the student's disability, or whether it's behavior not as a result of that student's disability. And you often go through a different disciplinary process if you determine that it's a manifestation of a student's disability. And so if you skip that process, you're denying the civil rights of a student with a disability by flagging them and putting them on a disciplinary track that is more likely to interact with law enforcement. And we know once that happens, that students with disabilities are more likely to be disciplined harsher, more likely to go to juvenile justice incarceration, and more likely to spend longer periods of time in that process. And so if you use this software in a way that goes around students' civil rights, that's when I think the Department of Education should be stepping in and enforcing these civil rights protections, not just Section 504, which we talked about, but a lot of the protections under IDEA.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And the way that some of this technology skips ordinary process is a point that we have emphasized. And the IDEA protections being short-circuited is absolutely a great insight. Thank you for that. Erin, what are your concerns about the way this technology puts students with disabilities in the school to prison pipeline?
I will say Lindsay took a lot of thoughts and including giving me the word manifestation determination. I've been trying to pull that out of my head for weeks.
I literally wrote it down when he said it. So
yeah, so it's pretty much like making sure that federal regulations in IDEA, such as manifestation determination, and also like in my state, Massachusetts, we have our bullying statement that we have to consider and place an IEP per Massachusetts state law. So with any state rules that may touch on discipline or like the effects of bullying, that's also important. And I mean, in terms of fueling the school to prison pipeline, I mean, during my short time as a teacher, I've heard stories of kids accessing some very gruesome sites that they shouldn't know about that often contains content that is reportable to not only Child Protective Services, but even law enforcement, especially if they manage to access the dark web, where it's a lot easier to find those kind of contraband websites. And all that just fuels the pipeline, because with the tracking software, like an administrator could be sitting at home right now with the home screen of the whole of a whole entire class, and just waiting for that one student to open their computer and do something that was against policy or could be any way interpreted of violating local laws or having any kind of CPS concerns. And it just makes it so easy for them to gather that data and just punish, like, and quickly go up the escalation ladder. And I remember seeing in high school, seeing some of my classmates be put on probation for like the most ridiculous things. I'm like, they got put on probation for that? Like, this person did something a million times worse, and where's their probation?
Yeah, it's the concern that the technology here is automating disparities in discipline without the procedural protections that ought to be awarded. I'm going to hand it back to Elizabeth now to close us out. Erin and Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate the great conversation. Elizabeth, floor is yours.
Great. I just want to echo thank you, Lindsay, and hopefully you don't get upset with me for saying this, but especially thank you, Erin. Erin has worked a full day in the classroom and hopped on as soon as that wrapped up to join us. So just thank you, thank you, thank you. And Lindsay, thank you too. But also it's just such a important perspective to bring to this conversation, and also know that you've probably had a very wild day, week. So just thank you. As actually Lindsay previewed without me having to do it, we are hosting our next webinar on how this technology can lead to discipline as well as increased interactions with law enforcement. That webinar will be on November 17th at 2 p.m. My colleague dropped the information on how to register for that in the chat. You can also access that information on our website. And last but not least, it would not be a CDT webinar if we didn't show you all of our myriad resources on this topic. So the first one that you'll see on there, mental health and students with disabilities, is the one that we talked about today. We just released this morning. And for the webinar on the 17th, we'll also be releasing previously unshared research on discipline and law enforcement. So we look forward to continuing the conversation then. And again, I'll just wrap up by saying thank you, Lindsay, thank you, Erin, thank you to NCLD for all of your leadership on this work. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.